All right, let's dive into a classic today. It's the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. This thing,
Oh, yeah.
it's packed with creatures you won't find anywhere else. And some seriously weird lore, too.
It really is a DM's dream. You've got plant monsters and shadow creatures,
Oh, yeah.
new kinds of dragons. We're talking about a whole ecosystem of the strange and dangerous, all specific to the Greyhawk setting.
Exactly. But here's the catch. It's from an older edition of D&D. So today we're not just summarizing it.
No.
We're going full mad scientist trying to figure out how to bring these Greyhawk monsters into 5th edition D&D.
Yeah, think of it like a conversion workshop, right? We'll look at the original stats, look at the lore, then
Yeah.
brainstorm how to make them work in a modern game. Challenge rating, abilities, the flavor, the whole package.
The whole thing. All right, let's start with a bang. How about those aspis? Immune to cold and electricity.
Ooh.
Take half damage from fire. Sounds pretty tough. But what really caught my eye is that Queen's acid. Potent enough to eat through metal and wood in a single round.
Yeah, that's some serious acid. Imagine the environmental hazards you could create with that. A dungeon room where the floor is slowly dissolving, forcing players to think fast. And think about this, the book mentions that they use scents offensively, even driving giant rats into a frenzy against their enemies. What if that's how the acid works? Not just a spray, but a pheromone-laced vapor that triggers aggression in certain creatures.
Oh, that's sinister. It gives them the unique tactical niche, too.
Yeah.
Instead of just being another damage dealer, right? It's about how that acid changes the entire dynamic of an encounter.
Speaking of dynamics, how about the beastmen? They can change their fur color to blend in with their surroundings. Camouflage is an obvious 5th edition conversion, but how do we make it more than just advantage on stealth?
Well, maybe they can subtly influence the perception of others, not full illusion magic or anything like that, but just a
Robert.
subtle warping of light and shadow. Make them seem like part of the scenery until it's too late. Imagine the party walking right past a disguised beastman, thinking it's just a bush or a rock formation.
That's creepy. It plays into that whole shapeshifter vibe, but without being too overpowered. And remember, the book mentions them taking prisoners and stripping them of their belongings. What if that's tied to the camouflage? Like they disorient their victims, then vanish into the surroundings with their loot.
Now we're talking. That's the kind of unique twist that makes a monster memorable. And speaking of memorable, up next we have the Buka. Tiny, peaceful relatives of pixies, but with a serious family bond. Harm one, and you're in for a world of hurt from the rest of the family.
They're like the ultimate neighborhood watch, and their invisibility makes them perfect for setting up elaborate traps and pranks. Think Home Alone, but with fey magic.
Right. It makes you think twice about engaging them in combat, too.
Mm.
Do you really want to risk the wrath of a whole Buka clan
Right.
for a minor inconvenience? It's a great way to encourage creative problem-solving and role-playing from your players.
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this deep dive with your fellow D&D enthusiasts. And be sure to leave a comment below, sharing your personal experiences or pointing out anything we might have missed.
Absolutely. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the Book-On. They're brownies, but not the helpful kind. These guys are distrusting, hostile, and masters of traps and stealth. Sounds like trouble to me.
They're like the dark reflection of the Buka. Instead of playful pranks, they're setting deadly ambushes in the forest. And their heightened senses, especially their hearing, make them incredibly difficult to surprise.
Yeah, in 5th edition, I think we could give them advantage on perception checks involving sound.
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe even a limited blindside ability.
Yeah.
Just imagine the party trying to sneak through the woods, only to realize they're being stalked by a Book-On who can hear every single footstep.
Talk about a tense situation. And remember, the book doesn't specify why they're so distrusting. What if they're guarding something? An ancient artifact, a hidden grove, or maybe even a portal to another realm.
Ooh, that's a great hook for an adventure. Gives them a purpose beyond just being grumpy ambushers.
Speaking of purpose, let's talk about dragons. But not just any dragons. The Greyhawk Monster Compendium introduces 4 new types of dragons: Cloud, Mist, Shadow, and Brown.
Wait, new dragon types? I got here. Let's start with the Cloud and Mist dragons. They sound like they'd be visually stunning.
Absolutely. The cloud dragon, with its silver scales tinged with orange, can actually assume a cloud-like form. Imagine a party traveling through a mountain range, and suddenly this storm cloud just detaches itself from the sky and reveals a massive dragon, lightning crackling around its claws.
Okay, that's epic.
Yeah.
In 5th edition, we could give them resistance to ranged attacks while they're in this form. and maybe even advantage on stealth checks in the air.
Oh, for sure.
It's a perfect way to represent their connection to the sky and their ability to blend into storms.
And the mist dragon is equally cool. It dwells near waterfalls, coastlines. Its lair is shrouded in mist. Imagine a party exploring a coastal cave, the air thick with mist, and suddenly this shadowy form emerges from the vapor and reveals a dragon with scales the color of sea foam, breath weapon of scalding vapor.
Now that's atmosphere. We could give them a similar cloud form ability like the cloud dragons,
Yeah.
but tied to areas of mist or fog.
Oh, for sure.
It makes them masters of their environment, able to appear and disappear at will.
And think about their breath weapon. It could be a cone of fire damage, but with a lingering fog effect that obscures vision. That adds a tactical element, forcing the party to think about positioning and area denial.
I love it. We're taking these classic concepts and giving them a modern twist. And speaking of twists, up next we have a creature that's less about combat and more about treasure. The giant dragonfly.
Yes. These creatures are known for their valuable metallic skin, which could make for a unique quest item or crafting component. Imagine a wizard seeking a specific part of a giant dragonfly's wing to create a potion of flying, or a noble wanting a cloak made from their iridescent scales.
That's a great way to tie them into the world beyond just being a random encounter, right?
Right.
They become part of the economy, the ecosystem, even the fashion scene. It adds a layer of complexity to encounters with them, right? Do you try to kill the giant dragonfly and harvest that valuable skin?
Right.
Or do you try to capture it alive, maybe even befriend it?
Right.
Speaking of befriending, or rather not befriending, let's talk about the Greyhawk. These are elves, but they're strong, they're xenophobic, and seriously skilled with traps and wilderness combat. Sounds like a DM's dream for creating tension in a forest setting.
Oh, absolutely. Imagine the party stumbling upon a Grugosh village while they're exploring a dense forest. Do they attempt diplomacy? Or do they risk triggering a series of deadly traps? And their xenophobia adds another layer of challenge. It's not just about fighting. It's about understanding their culture, understanding their motivations.
Exactly. Are they protecting something? Are they victims of past conflicts? It's an opportunity to build a whole storyline around these creatures.
And don't forget their strength. They get a bonus to their strength score and are proficient with spears and bows.
Right.
That makes them a real threat in combat, not just a bunch of sneaky trap setters.
Yeah, you don't want to mess with them. Okay, we've talked about forest dwellers. Now let's dive into the swamp. We've got the Gripply. Intelligent, frog-like humanoids who trade rare jungle items.
They sound like a great opportunity for role-playing and intrigue. Maybe they have information that the party needs, or they're willing to trade for something that the party has. But their natural caution and the potential for conflict could create complications.
Right, exactly. Maybe they're suspicious of outsiders, or they have their own agendas. It's a chance to explore themes of trust, communication, and understanding different cultures.
And don't forget their unique physiology. They're adapted to the swamp.
Right.
With long tongues, sticky fingers, and maybe even a poison sac. Those could all be interesting abilities to translate to 5e.
For sure. Okay, we've had some lighter moments. Now it's time for something truly creepy. Hook horrors. These things can't use weapons because of their hooks, but their beaks deal automatic damage if both hooks hit.
Yeah, they're like a nightmare come to life. Imagine the party exploring a dark underground cavern, and suddenly these things drop from the ceiling, their hooks scrabbling for purchase.
And that automatic beak damage is brutal. It makes them a real threat, even at low levels.
Right. And their inability to use weapons, that's not a weakness. It's part of what makes them terrifying. They're purely instinctual creatures driven by hunger and aggression.
Don't forget to check out the video description for a link to the Greyhawk Monster Compendium so you can start your own deep dive into these fascinating creatures.
All right, before we move on, I gotta ask, what stands out to you about these monsters so far? Let us know in the comments below. And while you're there, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any future deep dives.
Okay, next up is a creature that's all about deception. The Ngundi. They use illusions to disguise themselves as attractive members of the opposite sex to lure in victims.
Talk about a dangerous date. And it's not just about physical attraction, right? What if they can tap into your deepest desires, your hopes, your fears, create an illusion that's tailored to your specific vulnerabilities?
That's devious. It makes them more than just a pretty face. They're master manipulators, playing on your emotions to get what they want.
And don't forget their physical weakness. They rely on trickery and poison to finish off their victims. That makes them a different kind of challenge for players, one that requires more than just brute force to overcome.
Exactly. All right, let's shift gears again and talk about the Keek, Monkey-like fiends that prefer to attack at night, using traps and stealth to their advantage.
Yeah, they're like the ultimate ninja monkeys. Imagine the party setting up camp in a forest, and suddenly they're awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of rustling leaves and snapping branches. Then they're suddenly surrounded by these shadowy figures, their eyes glowing in the darkness.
That's a classic horror movie setup. And their use of traps makes them even more dangerous, right?
Oh, for sure.
Maybe they rig the trees with snares and tripwires, or they drop poisonous spiders on unsuspecting victims.
And remember, they're fiends. That means they have a connection to the lower planes,
Right.
which could be a source of their cunning and cruelty. Maybe they're servants of a demon lord, or they've been corrupted by some evil force.
Okay, let's talk about a creature with a truly evocative name, the Necrophidius, sometimes called the death worm. It has a hypnotic dance of death that paralyzes its victims.
That's straight out of a nightmare. Imagine this giant worm-like creature writhing in the darkness, its luminescent patterns mesmerizing anyone who dares to look at it.
And that paralyzing dance could be a real challenge for players.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a gaze attack, or maybe it's a sonic effect that affects anyone within a certain radius.
And don't forget the death worm part, right?
Right.
It's not just paralyzing its victims, it's draining their life force.
Right.
Maybe it has a touch attack that deals necrotic damage and weakens the target's constitution score.
Okay, up next is a creature that's more of an environmental hazard than a direct threat. The needlemen. They're living plants that attack with, you guessed it, sharp needles.
They're like the ultimate thorny bush, but much, much worse. Imagine the party hacking their way through a dense jungle, and suddenly they're being pelted with these sharp needles, each one coated in a paralytic poison.
Yeah, in 5th edition, we could give them a ranged attack that inflicts the poison condition. Or maybe even the paralyzed condition if the target fails a saving throw.
And remember, they're plants. That means they could be vulnerable to fire, but they could also regenerate quickly, making them a very persistent threat.
Speaking of persistent threats, let's talk about ravens and crows. Now, these might seem like mundane creatures, but the Greyhawk Monstrous Compendium highlights their potential to blind opponents by attacking their eyes.
That's right. It's a reminder that even seemingly harmless creatures can be dangerous in a fantasy setting. And it adds a whole new dimension to encounters with them. Are they just scavengers, or are they something more sinister?
Exactly. In 5e, we could give them a low probability attack that has a chance to blind a target. It wouldn't be their primary attack or anything like that. But it would make players think twice about underestimating them.
And it could lead to some interesting role-playing opportunities, right?
Right.
Maybe a flock of ravens is being controlled by a hag. Or maybe they're messengers for a powerful druid.
Okay, let's move on to a creature that's both familiar and unsettling. The Scarecrow. Now, these aren't just harmless decorations. They're magically animated.
Oh, yeah.
And quite strong, serving as guardians or unexpected threats.
Yeah, they're like the ultimate creepypasta come to life. Imagine the party camping out in a field and suddenly the Scarecrow springs to life, its straw stuffing rustling, its eyes glowing with an eerie light.
That's a classic horror image. In 5th edition, we could give them advantage on saving throws against being charmed or frightened. And their attacks could inflict the frightened condition on humanoids.
And think about their construction. They're made of straw, wood, and cloth,
Right.
which could give them resistance to certain damage types, but also make them vulnerable to fire.
Okay, let's talk about a classic D&D monster with a chilling twist. The Slow Shadow. It drains life force and slows its victims. And anyone killed by it becomes a lesser slow shadow.
They're like the ultimate zombie horde, but with a touch of Lovecraftian horror. Imagine a party exploring a dark, abandoned city, and suddenly they're surrounded by these shadowy figures. Their movements slow and deliberate, their touch draining the life from their victims.
And that's just the beginning, right? Each victim killed by a slow shadow becomes another one, creating this terrifying chain reaction. In 5th edition, we could represent their life drain ability with a necrotic damage attack that reduces the target speed.
And their immunity to non-magical weapons makes them even more challenging, right?
Oh, yeah.
It forces the party to rely on spells or enchanted weapons, which could drain their resources very quickly.
Okay, let's talk about a creature that's all about stealth and assassination. The Skulk. They can blend into the background and are masters of backstabbing.
They're like the ultimate rogue's nightmare. Imagine the party sneaking through a dungeon, and suddenly one of them feels this cold blade at their throat. They turn around, but there's no one there. just a faint flicker of movement in the shadows.
That's creepy.
Yeah.
And their backstab ability could be represented in 5e with a sneak attack, dealing extra damage when they have advantage on the attack roll.
And their ability to blend into their surroundings makes them incredibly difficult to track. Maybe they have advantage on stealth checks while in dim light or darkness, or maybe they can even turn invisible for a short duration.
Speaking of unique creatures, let's talk about the Spriggan. These are gnome-like creatures that can become giant-sized at will.
They're like the Incredible Hulk of the Fey world. Imagine a party encountering a small, mischievous Spriggan, thinking it's just a harmless prankster, but then suddenly it grows to an enormous size, its tiny eyes now burning with rage.
That's a great visual.
Yeah.
In 5th edition, we could give them 2 stat blocks, one for their small form and one for their giant form. Their small form would be relatively weak, but their giant form would be a force to be reckoned with.
And think about the tactical implications, right?
Right.
They could use their small form to scout ahead or infiltrate enemy camps, then transform into their giant form for a surprise attack.
All right, let's talk about a creature that's perfectly adapted to a cold mountain setting. The Tear. They're shaggy humanoids that distrust metal and clothing and worship a snow god.
They're like the ultimate survivalists, perfectly in tune with their harsh environment. Imagine a party trying to cross a treacherous mountain pass. And suddenly, they're ambushed by these fur-clad figures, their eyes piercing through the blinding snow.
In 5e, we could give them advantage on saving throws against cold damage, and their attacks could deal extra damage to creatures wearing metal armor.
And think about their cultural beliefs, right? Their distrust of metal and clothing suggests a deep connection to nature and a rejection of civilization. That could lead to some very interesting role-playing encounters.
Exactly. Okay, we've had some creepy creatures, but now it's time for something truly unsettling. The Tendamort. It's blind, but it can sense body heat and attacks with paralyzing tentacles.
They're like a Lovecraftian horror come to life. Imagine the party exploring a dark, dank cave, and suddenly they feel this cold, slimy touch on their skin. They spin around, but there's nothing there. Just a faint, musty smell and a sense of dread crawling up their spines.
That's nightmare fuel right there. In 5e, we could give them blind sight out to a certain radius, but only against creatures emitting heat.
Right.
And their tentacles could inflict the paralyzed condition on a successful hit.
And their vulnerability to bright light could be a key weakness. It creates this dynamic where the party has to balance dealing damage with illuminating the area to keep the Tendamort at bay.
Exactly. Okay, next up is a creature shrouded in mystery, the Turg. It's a dog-like predator with hints of tiger ancestry. There's a lot of room for interpretation with this one.
They're like a blank canvas for DMs to paint their own stories on. Are they simply a natural predator? Or is there something more to their existence? Maybe they're connected to the Feywild, or they're the result of some ancient magical experiment.
Exactly. In 5e, we could give them a unique ability that reflects their unknown origins. Maybe they have a howl that can charm or frighten creatures, or maybe they have a limited form of shape-shifting.
And their combination of canine and feline traits makes them a versatile threat. They could be fast and agile, but also strong and ferocious.
Now, for a classic monster that's sure to send chills down your spine, the Vampiric Mist. A gaseous creature that drains blood for sustenance. This is a classic horror trope.
It's the unseen terror, the creeping dread that slowly saps your strength. Imagine the party exploring a haunted castle, and suddenly the air grows cold and heavy. A faint mist swirls around their feet, and they feel a strange weakness creeping through their limbs.
And that's just the beginning, right? As they spend more time in the mist, their blood is slowly drained away, leaving them weak and vulnerable. In 5e, we could represent this with a necrotic damage aura that affects anyone within a certain radius.
And remember, it's a mist. That means it can seep through cracks and crevices, making it nearly impossible to contain.
Right. And their vulnerability to sunlight and running water, it makes them a classic horror movie monster. It gives the party a chance to exploit their weaknesses, but it also creates a sense of urgency.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on these conversions. What would you do differently? Let us know in the comments below.
Okay, let's move on to the Wood Giant. These giants are already formidable opponents, but the Greyhawk Monstrous Compendium gives them a unique twist. They can become invisible in forests.
They're like the ultimate forest guardian, able to blend into their surroundings and strike without warning. Imagine a party traveling through a dense forest, and suddenly they hear this thunderous roar. They look around, but there's nothing there. Just a faint tremor in the ground and a sense of impending doom.
That's terrifying. In 5th edition, we could give them advantage on stealth checks while they're in forested terrain, and maybe even allow them to hide as a bonus action if they haven't moved during their turn.
And think about their connection to the forest. They're not just hiding in the trees.
Right.
They're part of the forest itself. Maybe they can command plants to attack their enemies, or they can use their knowledge of the terrain to set up ambushes.
And finally, we come to a creature that's both iconic and fearsome, the Yethhound, immune to non-magical weapons, and their howl can chill the blood of even the bravest warrior.
They're like the harbingers of death, the hounds of the underworld. Imagine a party traveling through a desolate moor, and suddenly they hear a chilling howl in the distance. The hair on their necks stands on end, and a cold dread grips their hearts.
In 5th edition, we could represent their immunity to non-magical weapons by giving them resistance to all damage except force damage.
Right.
And their chilling howl could be a fear effect that forces creatures to make a wisdom saving throw or become frightened.
And their connection to the Shadowfell adds a whole other layer of creepiness. Maybe their howl can temporarily banish creatures to the Shadowfell,
Oh, wow.
or maybe they can summon shadows to fight alongside them.
That's a great way to tie them into the cosmology of the D&D multiverse. It makes them more than just scare hogs. They're gateways to a realm of darkness and despair.
And that wraps up part 1 of our deep dive into the Greyhawk Monster Compendium.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still plenty more to explore. Make sure to tune in next time as we continue our journey through this treasure trove of creatures. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. You ready to tackle some more of these crazy creatures?
Absolutely. Last time we explored a bunch of creatures from Aspis to Yethhounds, but
Yeah.
this book is so packed with weirdness we've barely scratched the surface.
Okay, so last time we ended with Yethhounds. How about we jump right into another iconic D&D monster with a Greyhawk twist, the giant iguana. We all know giant lizards are a staple of fantasy, but this one's got some extra bite. Literally.
Yeah, these aren't just oversized geckos. The book highlights their camouflage, Andy, their ability to swallow creatures whole. It's giving me some serious King Kong vibes.
Imagine the party's fighter getting gulped down, their muffled cries echoing from inside the beast. Talk about a rescue mission with a time limit.
Well, it wouldn't just be about damage either. Think about the claustrophobia, the digestive fluids, maybe even a STR check to claw your way out before you become iguana chow.
Okay, moving on from giant lizards, how about something completely different? The Horgar, immune to acid, fire, AND electricity.
Wow.
This thing's basically a walking bunker.
It's making me think of those extremophiles, the microbes that live in volcanoes and stuff. This thing sounds like it evolved to survive in the most hostile environments imaginable.
Right. High AC, damage resistance, maybe even an ability to reflect some of that elemental damage back at attackers. But here's the twist. It apparently flees from combat, unless cornered.
That's interesting. So it's not mindlessly aggressive. Maybe it's a scavenger that only fights when threatened. Or perhaps it's guarding something valuable and only attacks as a last resort.
Ooh, that's a great hook.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what's so important that this super durable creature is willing to risk its life to protect it?
And it forces the party to think outside the box. How do you defeat an enemy that doesn't want to fight? Do you try to outsmart it, trap it, maybe even reason with it?
Now, we talked about Ngundi before, but they're worth revisiting because they're not just about illusion magic. The book also mentions their telepathic communication, which is pretty creepy.
Yeah, it takes their manipulation to a whole new level, not just tricking your eye, but whispering thoughts and suggestions into your mind, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion.
Imagine the party starting to distrust each other because of an Ngundi's telepathic whispers. Talk about a recipe for disaster. It's like a psychological horror movie where you can't even trust your own thoughts.
Exactly. And remember, their illusions are based on your desires. What if they could create a telepathic link that shows you your heart's greatest desire? But it's all a trap.
All right, time for a quick reminder. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into classic D&D resources. And if you have any thoughts on these conversions, be sure to leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your ideas.
Now, from the unsettling to the downright terrifying, let's talk about the crypt thing. an undead guardian of tombs and graves.
Okay.
But these aren't just your average zombies. They come in two flavors, ancestral and summoned.
That's a cool distinction. Maybe ancestral crypt things are bound to a specific location and gain strength from it, while summoned ones are more mobile but have a limited lifespan.
Right. Maybe the ancestral ones have advantage on saving throws while within a certain radius of their burial site. Or perhaps they can drain the life force of anyone who desecrates the graves they guard.
And imagine the summoned ones being used as shock troops by a necromancer.
Oh, yeah.
They could teleport into battle, unleash a wave of terror, and then vanish before the party could even react.
And their connection to the dead could be a source of information. Maybe they have fragmented memories of the past. Or they can sense the presence of other undead creatures.
Okay, we've had some creepy undead, but now it's time for the ultimate nightmare fuel. The Sons of Kilius. These undead beings can infect living creatures, turning them into more Sons of Kilius.
Talk about a pandemic horror campaign. This is the kind of threat that could wipe out entire cities if left unchecked. It's not just about fighting them, it's about containing the spread, finding a cure, and maybe even making some tough moral choices along the way.
Right. Do you sacrifice one infected person to save the many? Do you risk your own life to find a cure? It's a recipe for some seriously intense roleplay.
And their immunity to mind-influencing effects makes them even more terrifying. You can't reason with them, you can't control them, you can only destroy them.
Okay, let's take a break from the undead apocalypse and talk about something a little less world-ending. Mites. They're tiny, mischievous humanoids who love to set traps and steal belongings.
They're like the ultimate nuisance pests. Imagine the party setting up camp and suddenly their rations are disappearing, their equipment is malfunctioning, and they're constantly being tripped up by hidden traps.
And their small size makes them incredibly difficult to deal with, right?
Oh, yeah.
They can squeeze into tiny spaces, hide in plain sight, and swarm their enemies with overwhelming numbers.
Right. And their bite attacks might not be deadly, but they could inflict a disease that causes itching, sneezing, and general distraction. It's a great way to add a bit of lighthearted chaos to a campaign.
Speaking of chaos, let's revisit the Buka. We talked about their invisibility and trap-setting abilities before, but the book also mentions their love of gold, jewelry, and magic items.
It's like a combination of leprechaun and magpie. Imagine the party trying to keep track of their valuables while a band of invisible buka are flitting around, snatching anything that glitters. It could be hilarious.
And their telekinesis adds another layer of mischief, right?
Right.
Maybe they're constantly rearranging furniture, swapping belongings, or even levitating sleeping party members. It's a great way to inject some lighthearted fun into a tense dungeon crawl.
Okay, let's get back to some monstrous plants. Up next is the delightfully named plant, carnivorous.
Oh, yeah.
It's got 12 barbed needles for draining blood. Talk about a gruesome way to go.
It's like a Venus flytrap on steroids.
Yeah.
Imagine the party hacking their way through a dense jungle, and suddenly one of them gets ensnared by these barbed needles, their life force slowly draining away.
And it wouldn't just be about damage either. Think about the struggle to break free, the panic of watching your life force dwindle, maybe even the risk of infection from those barbed needles.
And remember, it's a plant. So fire would be a good way to deal with it. But you have to be careful not to set the whole jungle ablaze.
Let's shift from the jungle to the depths of the earth. Have you ever seen a movie where a giant tentacle monster bursts out of the ground? That's what the giant polyp is all about.
Oh yeah, classic dungeon crawler stuff. Imagine the party exploring a subterranean cavern, and suddenly the ground starts to tremble. Then, with a sickening squelch, a giant tentacle erupts from the earth, flailing wildly, snatching at anything within reach.
And those tentacles wouldn't just be for grabbing. They could also have a constricting ability, squeezing the life out of their victims. And maybe they have a paralytic venom that weakens the party's defenses.
And remember, it's a polyp. That means it could have multiple tentacles attacking from different angles, overwhelming the party with sheer brute force.
Okay, we talked about ravens and crows earlier, but the Greyhawk Monstrous Compendium goes a step further. By introducing huge ravens and giant ravens, we're not just talking bigger birds here, we're talking monstrous corvids with potentially terrifying abilities.
Right. Imagine a flock of huge ravens descending on the party, their razor-sharp beaks and talons tearing through armor and flesh. And those giant ravens could be even worse. Maybe they can carry off small creatures, or maybe they serve as mounts for some other monstrous creature, like a goblin warlord or a hag coven.
And remember their intelligence. Ravens and crows are notoriously smart, so these giant versions could be incredibly cunning and dangerous. Maybe they can mimic sounds, steal objects, or even set traps.
Okay, now for a creature that's less about brute force and more about defense, the sea snail. It's a massive conch that lives in the ocean and releases a paralyzing neurotoxin.
This is giving me some serious Nautilus vibes. Imagine the party sailing across a vast ocean, and suddenly their ship runs aground on a giant conch shell. Then, with a sickening hiss, the shell opens, revealing a massive pulsating creature with a cloud of paralyzing gas swirling around it.
Yeah, this isn't a creature you want to mess with. In 5e, we could give it a paralyzing breath weapon that affects anyone within a certain radius, and its shell could give it incredible damage resistance, making it a real tank.
And maybe it has a sonic attack that can stun or disorient its attackers. It's a creature that's built for survival, and it's not going down without a fight.
Let's talk about skulks again. We've already established that they're masters of stealth and assassination. But let's think about how we can really make them shine in 5e.
Their ability to blend into the background is key. So we could give them advantage on stealth checks in urban environments. Maybe they can even hide in plain sight, disguised as statues, shadows, or even other people.
And their backstabbing expertise could be represented with a sneak attack that deals extra damage when they have advantage. Maybe they also have a poison that can paralyze or even kill their victims instantly.
And their knowledge of urban environments could give them a tactical edge. Maybe they can navigate rooftops and alleys with ease, or they can use their surroundings to create distractions and ambushes.
Okay, let's revisit the Spriggan. We talked about their shapeshifting before, but let's really dig into their mischievous nature.
Yeah, these aren't just hulking brutes, they're tricksters at heart, and that's what makes them so fun to play with. Imagine a party encountering a Spriggan in its small form, only to be tricked, misled, or even robbed blind before it reveals its true size.
And their illusions could be really creative. Maybe they can make themselves appear as other creatures. Or they can conjure up illusions that distract or frighten their opponents.
And their giant form wouldn't just be about smashing things, it could be about causing chaos and disruption, like uprooting trees, collapsing buildings, or even diverting rivers.
Okay, let's talk about the teller again. We talked about their distrust of metal and their connection to nature, but let's think about how their worship of a snow god could translate to 5e.
Maybe they have a cold-based breath weapon, or perhaps they can summon icy spirits to fight alongside them, and their connection to nature could give them a variety of abilities, like the ability to control animals, blend into their surroundings, or even heal themselves from the land.
And their distrust of metal could be a weakness as well as a strength.
Right.
Maybe they're vulnerable to certain types of magic, or they're easily tricked by illusions. It's a great way to create a balanced and interesting encounter.
And remember, they're not just mindless barbarians. They have a culture, a belief system, and a way of life that's worth exploring. Maybe they're willing to trade with outsiders, but only on their own terms. Or maybe they're fiercely protective of their sacred sites and will attack anyone who dares to trespass.
Okay, we've talked about a lot of creatures from the surface world, but now it's time to delve back into the darkness. Let's revisit the Tentamort.
Okay.
Their ability to sense body heat makes them incredibly dangerous in enclosed spaces. Imagine the party exploring a labyrinthine dungeon, the air thick with the stench of decay. They can't see the Tentamort, but they can feel its presence. A cold, slimy dread creeping up their spines.
And their paralyzing tentacles are a nightmare to deal with. In 5e, we could give them a reach attack that can grapple multiple targets, pulling them closer to their gaping maws.
And their vulnerability to bright light as a tactical element.
Right.
Do you risk using a torch to see what you're fighting? Or do you stumble around in the darkness, hoping to avoid those deadly tentacles?
It's a tough choice.
Let's revisit the Turg. We talked about their mysterious origins and their blend of canine and feline traits. But let's really dig into their potential as a creature of the Feywild.
Their connection to the Feywild could give them a variety of abilities, from illusions and enchantments to teleportation and shapeshifting. Maybe they can lure their victims with ethereal music. Or perhaps they can vanish into thin air, only to reappear behind their enemies.
And their animalistic instincts could be both a strength and a weakness.
All right.
They might be fierce and unpredictable in combat, but they could also be easily distracted or tricked.
And their connection to the Feywild could also make them vulnerable to certain types of magic, like cold iron or spells that target Fey creatures.
Okay, let's talk about the vampiric mist again. We talked about their blood-draining abilities and their vulnerability to sunlight, but let's think about how we can really make them terrifying in 5e. Their gaseous form could make them incredibly difficult to contain. Imagine them seeping through cracks in walls, flowing under doors, and even possessing inanimate objects to attack the party.
And their blood-draining ability could be represented with a necrotic damage aura that weakens the party's defenses and heals the vampiric mist. And maybe their touch can inflict a disease that slowly drains the victim's life force, turning them into a husk of their former selves.
And their connection to the Shadowfell could give them even more terrifying abilities. Maybe they can teleport through shadows. Or perhaps they can summon shadowy creatures to fight alongside them. Okay, let's revisit the wood giant. We talked about their invisibility and their connection to the forest, but let's think about how we can really make them a force of nature in 5e.
Their ability to blend into their surroundings could be represented with a camouflage ability that makes them nearly impossible to detect in forested terrain. And their connection to the forest could give them a variety of abilities, like the ability to control plants, summon woodland creatures, or even regenerate their health from the earth.
And their immense strengths and size would make them a formidable opponent in close combat. Maybe they can hurl trees like javelins. Or perhaps they can crush their opponents with their bare hands.
And remember, they're not just mindless brutes. They're intelligent creatures with their own culture and beliefs. Maybe they're guardians of the forest. Or perhaps they're territorial creatures that will attack anyone who dares to intrude on their domain.
And finally, let's revisit the Yethhound. We talked about their chilling howl and their connection to the Shadowfell, but let's think about how we can really make them the hounds of the underworld in 5e.
Their chilling howl could be represented with a fear effect that paralyzes their victims with terror. And maybe their bite can inflict a curse that weakens the target's connection to the material plane, making them more susceptible to Shadowfell magic.
And their connection to the Shadowfell could give them a variety of other abilities, like the ability to teleport through shadows, summon shadowy creatures, or even drain the life force of their victims.
And their pack-hunting instincts could make them even more dangerous. Imagine a pack of Yethhounds running down their prey, their chilling howls echoing through the night.
That's a terrifying image. And their immunity to non-magical weapons makes them a real challenge for low-level parties. It forces the players to think creatively and use their resources wisely.
All right, that wraps up part 2 of our deep dive into the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. We've covered a lot of ground, and we've barely scratched the surface of this amazing resource. But there's still one more part to go, so be sure to tune in next time as we finish our journey through this treasure trove of creatures.
Welcome back, adventurers. It's the final stretch of our deep dives into the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. You feeling inspired to unleash some of these creatures on your players?
I know I am. But before we wrap up, I think it's important to step back from the individual stat blocks and consider what makes this compendium so special. You know, it's not just a list of monsters, it's a window into a unique world.
Exactly. Each creature has a story to tell. A place in Greyhawk's ecosystem and its history. Take the Necrophidius, for example. You could just treat it as a creepy worm with a paralyzing gaze.
Right.
But what if it's more than that? What if its dance of death is actually a ritual?
Ooh.
A connection to some ancient necromantic power.
Ooh, I like that. Suddenly it's not just a random encounter, it's a clue, a piece of a larger puzzle. Maybe there's a cult that worships the Necrophidius, using its power for their own dark purposes.
Right. Or think about the Spriggan. We talked about their shape-shifting and their love of chaos. But what if that's a reflection of the Feywild's influence on Greyhawk? Maybe the Spriggan are guardians of the boundaries between the realms, their chaotic nature, a manifestation of the wild magic that bleeds through.
That's a great point. It connects these creatures to the larger cosmology of D&D, giving them a deeper significance beyond just being cool monsters to fight.
Exactly. And it gives DMs so much material to work with. Imagine a campaign where the party has to deal with the consequences of a Spriggan's pranks. Or maybe they have to track down a stolen artifact that's fallen into the hands of the Feywild through a Spriggan's portal.
And don't forget the Tears. Their distrust of metal and clothing, their worship of a snow god, it all speaks to a culture that's deeply connected to the natural world. Maybe even in opposition to the more civilized races of Greyhawk.
Exactly. Maybe they're the remnants of an ancient people who were driven from their lands by the expansion of human kingdoms. Or maybe they're protectors of some sacred site. Their strange customs and rituals, a way of warding off those who would desecrate it.
And that's the beauty of the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. It's not just about stats and mechanics. It's about sparking your imagination, giving you the tools to build stories and create truly memorable encounters.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's our challenge to you. Don't just use these creatures. Understand them. Dig into their lore, explore their motivations, and let them inspire you to create something truly unique in your own campaigns.
Maybe that giant iguana isn't just a hungry lizard. Maybe it's the guardian of a lost temple, its camouflage, a way of protecting a sacred relic from those who would seek to steal it.
Or maybe those manates aren't just annoying pests. Maybe they're the remnants of a once powerful civilization. They're traps and tricks, a way of surviving in a world that's forgotten them.
And maybe that Yethhound isn't just a scary dog. Maybe it's a lost soul, trapped between the material plane and the Shadowfell. Its chilling howl, a cry for help, or maybe a warning of the darkness that's coming for us all.
Okay, before we sign off, don't forget to check out the video description for a link to the Greyhawk Monster Compendium. It's a treasure trove of inspiration, and we highly recommend diving into it yourself.
And be sure to let us know what you discover. Share your thoughts, your homebrew stats, your encounter ideas. We want to hear it all.
Absolutely. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that bell so you don't miss any of our future deep dives.
Until next time, happy gaming!